I'd like to talk to you today about this trust issue, and this is at the very heart of probably some of the reservations around the uptake of digital ag in Australia. For the last 18 months, and I'd just like to acknowledge my co-author, and Jay Sanderson is a colleague of mine. We both work in ASIPA, and we have for the last 18 months been working on a Commonwealth-funded project looking at removing barriers to adoption for the uptake of digital ag in Australia. And we've been leading the legal and regulatory and governance aspect of that particular project. That's the first time that all 15 RDCs have joined together. So it's a joint project with 21 organisations, including CSIRO, Data to Decisions, all 15 RDCs. So we've been working across all industries in Australia, which is the first time that they have jointly come together. So it's quite a unique recognition of the fact that data, and ag data in particular, is worthy of this attention. But I'll just try and give you a bit of a snapshot of some of the issues that we've come across in the research that we've done. So it'll come as no surprise to you to know that law lags behind many areas. It takes many years for legal and regulatory regimes to develop, and it comes often well after the problem arises. Essentially, the laws in and around data in Australia, and this is personal data, medical data, health data, agricultural data, financial data, all sectors of data are basically ad hoc and piecemeal. So we don't have any data laws in Australia, and that is unlike other jurisdictions in and around the world. So what we've found, and if we just focus on ag data in this session, is that basically because I can talk to you about intellectual property law, copyright law is really the area of law that protects some data sets, and I can talk at length about who owns data, and if that wants to be one of your questions, I'm more than happy to talk about that. But put simply, copyright law protects and gives property rights in data sets, and that is some data. It doesn't protect raw data. Now, those of you who are data scientists will argue this, but the law views it very simply. That is, there is raw data, which is mere information or mere facts, and that's not protectable. No one has rights in that information. So whether it's 7 mils of rain on a Tuesday, no one can own that. But when that rainfall data is collected and aggregated in conjunction with different areas and different farms, etc., and it's put into a table, and there's some valuable input into that, then intellectual property will step forward and say, yes, we recognise that, and we will provide property rights in that collection. Okay, so that's how the law treats it. So essentially around data, what we've seen is basically, with the move of agriculture into the digital sphere, instead of farmers owning their tractors and owning the seed that they plant, what we've seen now, and what I've seen in the last 15, 17 years, is that farmers are licensing their seed. So you've got patents over seed, so they license the seed, you get to use the seed, and you will pay a royalty at the end of when you yield. Similarly, with the digital software and technologies in precision agriculture, you may, John Deere will argue that you own your tractor. They say you have a license to use your tractor. And when you turn on that machine and you click the accept my John Deere, whatever it is, you are entering into essentially a software license that is not unlike any social media license. So it's like your Facebook, your Instagram, so that you agree to those terms and conditions of that technology, and those will be the terms that will govern the usage and management of your data that comes from that machine. And that applies whether it's an app that you download on your iPad or your computer, your technology, or on a drone. So what's important is to look at the actual ag data contracts, and that's what we've been doing for the last 18 months. And the key concerns that have been raised from producers and farmers are these three, if we kind of focus on them. And that is who owns their data, issues around control and access, who can use it. This issue of trust and transparency is at the very heart of all of the discussions around the concerns around ag data usage. But also on top of that, issues around privacy, safety and security. We've all probably know that in 2014, Monsanto had huge data breaches where people's credit card details were made available. So it's a real fear, and that's it's not surprising. Just only 3 weeks ago in the United States, and I've just put the reference at the bottom here for those of you who may be interested, there's actually a US Senate committee going on looking at basically technology in agriculture and data-driven farming. So this is only a couple of weeks ago. And I thought this quote basically goes to the very heart of this. This is from a farmer that big ag has been collecting our data for so long that there's this attitude that the way we farm carries no value. Well, it does. For farmers, the field is our business and the way we manage it is our formula for success. So why is it okay for these companies to claim the data as theirs and then sell it without our knowledge? This is a common concern that was expressed across all industries, across all states and all probably all areas in Australian agriculture. And I think it's just summed up that this is the same concerns that are basically being expressed at this very time in the United States, and it's no different in Europe. So CSIRO, as part of our project, has done a survey of 1,000 farmers, and I'll give you the links at the back if you're interested. It goes across industries. It looks at grains specifically, but it also looks at grains in relation to the mixed farming that happens on grains, whether, with grains and sheep or grains and cattle, for example. But the key concerns, and this just gives you some sense, basically 32% of the producers and farmers responded to a series of questions, and 32% said that they don't trust their actual service or technology providers in relation to the privacy of their ag data. 36% are concerned that their technology or service providers may share that data without permissions, and 33% are also concerned about privacy. So some of the questions are this issue around portability. If I put my data in, can I get my data back? Can I move it between a red and a green, for example? And that's at the very heart of it. People think once you give it over, it's gone, it's lost. And this issue about basically benefit sharing. Why is it that it's seen that it's the third parties who seem to be making the value rather than the individual farmers who contribute? As I said, it's the licenses that basically regulate the data that is generated on farm that you enter into. And a lot of the conversations we've had with producers is they say, oh, I just give my data to my agronomist. We don't have a contract. They've been doing it with my family for years. They're a trusted advisor. And then there's benchmarking practices that may be going on, but then the agronomist may start working for a technology provider, for example. What happens then? Pretty much whenever data is given over, whether it's done on a handshake or not, there'll be a contract. It may not be written down. In most cases it is, but it'll be a software contract. It'll be something that you click on, like the I agree, etc. But generally speaking, if you're giving over property and you're getting services in return, there'll be a contract. So 47% of primary producers said that they basically have no understanding of what those terms and conditions are in their software licenses. Usually that's because they're hidden so far in, and if you spend a lot of time looking at some of the large international agribusinesses contracts, there'll be a privacy policy, there'll be a data management policy, there'll be an IP policy, there'll be so many different policies that it would take you weeks to read between them and to try and make sense of them. So between 47% have no understanding and 27% basically have very little understanding. So that's concerning. In terms of data privacy, security and safety, what's really important is to draw the distinction between ag data and personal data. When we talk about data, most people think, if you think of all your social media platforms, like if I talk about Instagram, most of you, how many people don't have Instagram? Okay, there we go. That's quite a lot. For the people who do have Instagram, when you download that, what you might be interested to learn is similar to Facebook. But if you click on that, you give permission for Instagram to access the photos on your phone. And everybody goes, that's fine. What that means, it's not the photos that you choose to select and put up on Instagram to show your friends, and they're usually the better ones. It's all of the photos on your phone, the private ones that you choose not to share with Instagram. So you give permissions for them basically to access all of those photos. And that's something that's just a sense of the breadth of some of the contracts that are being presented to consumers. So in Australia, personal information has a whole gamut of law and regulatory kind of protections around it. So we have the Australian Privacy Act, we have the Australian Privacy Principles, and what that means is your personal information is protected. Now, your personal information is information that basically it can be used to identify you as an individual. Traditionally, it's been thought of as your name, address, phone number, place of business or whatever. It hasn't, our privacy legislation hasn't been extended at this point to include personal data. So it's still that traditional personal information. Agricultural data is not seen as personal information. So agricultural data is something valuable. It's, as you've seen from the quote, it's commercially valuable information, but it's different to your personal information. So ag data does not come under the Privacy Act at present. I mean, I can talk about the fact that, your location data, potentially I would argue that is personal information, because it does actually, once you have someone's, GPS location, you can pull down lots of data to a place and that will help identify an individual. But legally, that's not happened yet in Australia. So there's a really big gap, if you like, in terms of ag data. And I think what's really interesting is we've seen a lot of the large international tech providers, they will have privacy policies, and that deals with your personal information. They will have policies around your machine data. They will have policies around intellectual property. Now, as I said at the start, most data is not intellectual property. So to say that your intellectual property, and this is a conversation we're having with the RDCs, all RDCs have privacy policies. Most RDCs have intellectual property policies, but data doesn't fall within the definition of intellectual property. So what we're seeing is that there's a need essentially for data management policies as to indicate how the organisation is going to deal with and manage data. And that's not personal data, because that must be managed in accordance with the Privacy Act. So just to mention, in the privacy sphere, there's lots happening. In Europe, they're extending protections for individuals around privacy. So there's a lot of things coming down the pipeline from Europe. And in Australia, next year, we have a new piece of legislation. It's an amendment to the Privacy Act that where there has been a breach of personal data, there's a mandatory notification scheme. And that applies to, the Privacy Act applies to government organisations, government enterprises, or companies with a turnover of more than $3 million. So where there is a breach of someone's personal information, there must be mandatory notification telling people what data has been breached and what steps are being taken to remedy that. So that's going to be a new move forward in Australia as well. It's not surprising that there's mistrust. We've basically got, as far as I know, the first ag data case going on at the moment in the United States. It's Half Poultry and Tyson. And this is in relation to a very vertically integrated industry, the chicken meat processing industry. And it's basically an action by a class action by a group of chicken farmers against their processors, Tyson Food and a group of others, in relation to the fact that they've used the aggregated production data against them to lower payments made to the individual chicken farmers. That's a competition action. It's a class action under competition laws. But at the heart of it, it's a question around whose data that information is. So that's actually going through the Oklahoma courts at the moment, and there's no resolution, but it's something that's interesting, and I think it'll be the first of many, basically. So what I really wanted to talk to you about today is how to build trust around in this kind of uncertain climate. We've seen in the United States movements by the American Farm Bureau in conjunction with 37 of the ag tech businesses after concerns are expressed by American farmers, largely in the Corn Belt, about data security and privacy. The end of a long kind of lobbying process. They've developed the privacy and security principles for farm data, and I've given you that blue there. If you get the slides, you can link to it. You can have a read about them. There's basically 13 principles that deal with ownership, portability, security, transparency, privacy, etc. So this was an attempt to basically bring the ag tech businesses' license agreements into line with these principles. Now, they had 37 large organisations support this in principle, including John Deere, Monsanto, the really big players. But what's interesting, how they've implemented this, is that they've set up essentially what they call an ag data transparency evaluator. So Todd Jansen, who's a lawyer, is basically now the accreditor. So what tech companies can do is give forward their license agreements, and they'll compare them up against those 13 principles to see how consistent they are with the overarching principles. Now, when we talk about ownership, it's not saying that farmers... The American Farm Bureau says something interesting. They say farmers own their data. I don't think that's particularly helpful. It's not helpful to talk about ownership. It's helpful to talk about who has control. Because as you know, you can have ownership of your personal information, but if you choose to give it over to Facebook, you don't have control of that. So the language of ownership and data, I don't think is a helpful one. Let's talk about control and access. Who has control of the data? So what we've seen is, although 37 companies supported the idea of having these 13 principles, we've only had 5 or 6 who've actually gone forward and put their contracts up for comparison, and who've actually got the ag data transparency seal. So you get a stamp to say, yep, you're a good guy, basically, you're a good company. And the 10 questions there are basically around what will happen with the data once it's given over. We've similarly got progress in New Zealand, largely out of the dairy industry in relation to the Farm Data Code of Practice as well. Similarly, there's a similar logo system as well. So what these are attempts is to build confidence and trust in producers that they're dealing with companies that are going to do the right thing with their data and not on-sell it without permission, not deal with it or not profit from it without the consent. It is very much to do with the knowledge and transparency of the relationships that you're entering into. And this lack of transparency has been at the very heart of some of the discussions that we've had with producers. I will flag, just in the future, Australian Productivity Commission has recently released a report, and they are looking at bringing in data laws in Australia. But again, this is about personal information. And the question is, it really won't impact on agricultural data unless that's tied with personal information. But what this means is it's a shift that people who are aggregating data and who are keeping data will have responsibilities now. Pretty much it's one way at the moment. The data goes up and, there's kind of not a lot of transparency around how it's being dealt. This type of reform will mean that those people holding data may have to give it back to the contributors in a machine-readable form and give them the right to move that data should they so wish. So it's actually shifting the balance a little bit. Basically, the way in which we need to go forward in building trust with producers, and also it's not a kind of one-way thing. I think what's really important, there's some really good ag tech suppliers and providers out there who do the right thing, who are transparent, and we should reward them for being so. And I think we're trying to just level the playing field, but at the heart of it is, as Chris said, it's recognising that we need to have the right governance framework around and the right business models in place to facilitate that. As we talked about, and Brad gave you a really good detailed breakdown about cooperatives, so I won't go into it, but data cooperatives are one of the models that are being used, certainly in the States. We've got lots of examples, the Ag Data Coalition for growers, and the important thing is there's lots of hybrid co-ops. It's not one model. So as Brad said, it's important that you get your kind of goals in mind and your strategies as to what you're trying to achieve, as to which particular model you need to use to go forward. But given Brad's breadth, I won't go into that anymore. But as I said, I'll just close by saying that the project that we've been working on has produced 6 reports and an executive summary. This is the summary report, and what I've done for you is just to give you the actual breakdown of the reports and the links for you, so I encourage you to go and read them. There's basically one on telecommunications, connectivity issues around Australia. There is the CSIRO producer survey that looks at attitudes to data sharing, and it's really interesting to see cotton and grains are pretty good. There's a whole gamut in terms of different industries where there's more, the more vertically integrated, but also the more consumer-facing industries have great concerns as well. As I said, we've looked at the legal aspects, and that includes this issue of trust and willingness and transparency around the licence terms. But all of the reports are available there for you to have a look at, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions. And I'd like to thank you again for the invitation to come and speak.
Yeah,